I must have been about 8 or 9 years old when this happened. Back then, I was a quiet child, spending most of my time playing with my stuffed animals. My favorite was a little bear named Benny. He was small, a bit worn out, with round eyes and a blue ribbon. My mom used to say Benny had belonged to my dad when he was a child, so he was kind of a family heirloom. Every night, I would leave Benny at the edge of my bed, right next to my pillow, and somehow, I felt safer with him there. Life was simple, and Benny helped me face nightmares or anything else that scared me. One night, I remember waking up around 3 in the morning, thirsty, and I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water. My eyes were still heavy with sleep, and as I was heading back to my room, I saw something strange in the living room. There, in the middle of the floor, was Benny. I found it odd because I never left him anywhere but my bed. I thought maybe my mom or dad had placed him there for some reason, but that didn't make much sense. I picked Benny up, a little bothered but too tired to think much about it, and went back to bed, convinced it was just a weird coincidence. The next night, it happened again. I woke up for no reason, kind of an odd feeling that made me open my eyes in the middle of the night. This time, Benny wasn't in my room. I looked around, but he wasn't anywhere. I felt confused and at the same time, something felt off, like something wasn't right. I got up, did a quick search around the house, and found Benny in the hallway again, far from my bed. I picked him up and went back to my room, trying to convince myself I must have taken him with me by accident. But that night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard a sound. It was a soft whisper, almost like a pust. I froze in bed, holding Benny tighter against my chest. Then I heard it again, and it seemed to be coming from Benny himself. It sounded almost impossible, but I could swear he whispered my name. I just lay there, paralyzed, not knowing what to do. As strange as it seemed, I couldn't let go of him, so I shut my eyes and tried to ignore it, hoping it was just my imagination. The next day, I told my parents what had happened. I explained that Benny kept showing up outside my room and that he seemed to whisper my name during the night. They laughed and said it was just my imagination, that I was dreaming, and none of it was real. But seeing how insistent I was, my dad decided to put Benny in the attic, saying it would help me sleep better and stop having these dreams. I was a little upset, but I agreed. I thought that if Benny was out of my room, everything would go back to normal, and I wouldn't feel so weird at night. That night, I went to bed feeling relieved. But when I woke up, my heart nearly stopped. Benny was there, in my bed, again, exactly where I always left him. I couldn't understand how he had gotten out of the attic. My parents said no one had taken him out of there, and even they started to get suspicious. That's when I noticed something I had never seen before. There was a message written on Benny's tag, a short sentence handwritten that I had no memory of being there before. On the tag, in small, almost faded letters, it said, "I'm back." That sent a chill down my spine. It was impossible for someone to have written that without me noticing, and Benny was too old to suddenly have a new message on him. I showed my parents, but they tried to calm me down, saying I must have never noticed it before. But I knew I had looked at that tag many times when I was younger, and that sentence definitely hadn't been there. My dad, who was getting frustrated, took Benny and put him in the attic again, locking the door this time. I thought that would solve everything. But, to my surprise, the next morning, Benny was back in my room, sitting at the edge of the bed, just like before, with that empty look and a dark, almost sinister air. Now, even my mom seemed scared. She started asking me if I was playing a joke, but I swear I hadn't gone near the attic. My dad decided that maybe the best thing was to get rid of Benny, and I didn't disagree. Even though he was my favorite toy, I just wanted to feel safe again. That same day, my dad put Benny in a box and took him to the town dump. When we got home, I felt an enormous sense of relief, like I could finally relax. I spent the rest of the day trying to forget what had happened. But that night, I woke up again with that uneasy feeling. The room was dark, and everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to ignore it and closed my eyes, taking deep breaths to calm my mind. When the sun finally came up, I opened my eyes and nearly fell out of bed from shock. Benny was there, again, sitting at the edge of the bed, just like before. There was no way he could have come back. I had seen my dad throw him away. And then, I saw something that hadn't been there before. A new note on the tag. This time it said, "It's useless. I'll always be here." That's when I understood that this was more than just a toy, and somehow, Benny wasn't planning to leave me. After that, my mom decided that the only way out was to call someone to cleanse the energy in the house. She wasn't exactly superstitious, but by then, even she was terrified of Benny reappearing. We called an older woman my grandmother knew, someone who did prayers and said she understood these presences. When she arrived, she took one look at Benny, and her face immediately became serious. She said that something was attached to him, something that didn't want to leave. The woman performed some sort of ritual in the room, and then she recommended we burn Benny, saying that it was the only way to free whatever was trapped. We were reluctant, but deep down, we just wanted to end it all. So, that same night, my dad made a fire in the backyard, and together, we watched Benny being consumed by the flames. It was almost surreal, but the relief was instant. Since that day, we never saw or heard anything from Benny again.
At first, I didn't think much about the nightmares. They just seemed like ordinary bad dreams, something everyone has every now and then. I'm a simple guy, a college student, living in a small apartment. I've always been a good sleeper, but a few weeks ago, these dreams started to feel more real. At first, I just saw myself in a dark place, running, barely able to make out shadows in the corner of my eye. But soon I started noticing one detail that kept repeating: cold hands grabbing my ankles. And the feeling was so real. I could almost feel the chill of those fingers sinking into my skin, pulling me away from the light. Last week, things got even weirder. Every time I woke up, I felt this strange cold around my ankles. But last night, things got even more bizarre. When I got up, I felt a light pain, almost like a burning sensation. I looked down and saw red marks around my ankles, like someone had actually held me there. The marks looked like fingers, perfectly shaped, almost like fingerprints pressed into my skin. I've never had anything like this happen before, and it messed with me in a way I can't explain. After that night, sleeping became nearly impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt those cold hands again, gripping my ankles harder and harder. It was like something was waiting for me on the other side of sleep, eager to pull me away. The worst part was, even when I woke up, the feeling didn't go away immediately. It would stay there in my body, like a memory that refused to fade. I tried massaging my skin, rubbing my ankles, but nothing worked. It left me in a constant state of alert, like something was lurking, waiting for the smallest chance to grab me for good. In a few days, things went from bad to terrifying. One night, after nearly staying up all night, I finally dozed off, but I felt the hands again, colder and with a grip that almost paralyzed me. It was like I was stuck, unable to escape. When I finally managed to wake up, I looked at my ankles and couldn't believe it. The finger marks were even clearer and deeper, like someone had actually grabbed me with full force. This wasn't a normal irritation. It wasn't something I could just ignore. I tried everything to figure out what was happening. I spent hours researching online, trying to find some logical explanation for this. I read about sleep paralysis, hallucinations, even theories about the subconscious and extreme stress. But nothing seemed to fit. This wasn't just a dream, I knew that. Each night, those hands felt more real, and the marks on my ankles kept getting more visible. It was a mix of desperation and exhaustion, like my body was being drained with each cold touch. Then I decided to make one last attempt, visit an exorcist priest. I found a contact through a friend who said the priest was a specialist in supernatural cases. I wasn't even sure if I believed in that sort of thing, but at that point, I was so shaken up that any help seemed worth trying. I scheduled a time, and when I got to the church, the priest, an old man with a serious look, welcomed me without many questions. He seemed to understand I wasn't there out of curiosity or superstition. The priest took me to a small room in the back of the church, where he kept some religious objects and old books. The atmosphere was dark and quiet, and the smell of incense was so strong it felt like it filled the air with a heavy energy. He asked me to sit down and listen carefully while I explained everything about the nightmares and the marks on my ankles. During my story, he kept a steady expression, but I noticed his hand tightening around the crucifix hanging from his neck when I mentioned the feeling of cold hands. After hearing it all, he told me that it was common for people with these kinds of experiences to try and ignore what was happening, hoping it would go away on its own. But, according to him, the more we try to escape, the more these presences insist. The priest said there was something from the other side trying to keep me trapped, and that if I didn't face it somehow, the situation could get worse. He suggested we do a sort of blessing, a specific prayer for protection against dark influences. I didn't know what to believe, but I felt a slight relief knowing I wasn't facing this alone anymore. The priest stood up and went to a cabinet, where he took out a small bottle of oil. He explained that for protection and exorcism rituals, oil was a powerful element, used to purify and ward off any unwanted presence. He said this ritual would be a bit unusual, but it was necessary, given the intensity of what I was dealing with. He instructed me to take off my shoes and socks, and with a thin brush, he started applying the oil on my ankles, tracing small circles while murmuring a prayer in Latin. I could feel the oil cold on my skin, but at the same time, something warmer seemed to stir inside me. As he applied the oil, a strange sensation took over my body, like a wave of calm was trying to push out something deeply unsettling. The priest continued the prayers, and with each word, I felt the marks on my ankles tingling. I can't explain it, but it felt like the hands that grabbed me in my nightmares were being forced to let go, like the oil was some sort of barrier they couldn't cross. When the priest finished, he told me to wait and see if anything changed over the next few nights. He instructed me to keep my ankles rubbed with a bit of oil each night before bed, as a continuous protection. I'll admit I felt a bit ridiculous, but in that situation, I was willing to try anything. I went home feeling slightly relieved, but still with that lingering fear, not knowing if the ritual would be enough. That night, I applied the oil to my ankles and went to bed, trying to stay calm. I slept deeply, without any interruptions or nightmares. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the cold hands, and the next day, the marks were almost invisible. It was like all the weight had finally lifted. Since then, I haven't had another nightmare with those hands. I still don't know what really happened, but I keep a little bottle of oil by my bed, just to make sure nothing bad happens again.
It was around the beginning of October, I think. The days were already getting shorter, and I was adjusting to this quiet neighborhood I moved to a couple of months ago. I came here looking for a fresh start. It was a great neighborhood, peaceful streets, friendly families, nothing out of the ordinary. Just to give you some context, I tend to stay up late working on freelance projects, so I end up seeing things most people don't. That's how I noticed the van for the first time. Every night, around 2 a.m., a plain white van would park on the sidewalk across the street. It seemed a little weird, but at first, I didn't think much of it. Then I started noticing my neighbor. He's a guy in his 50s or so, with a strange vibe, always dressed in black, looking too put together, glasses that shone a little too brightly in the streetlight. Every night, at the same time, he'd leave the house with a package under his arm. He'd hand it off to a different person each time, and they'd walk off without saying a word. The deliveries weren't quick. He'd stand there, watching until they disappeared out of sight, almost like he wanted to make sure they knew exactly what they were taking. It started to bother me in a way I couldn't explain, but still, I never had any reason to question it. The nights went by, and I became more and more obsessed with my neighbor's bizarre routine. You know when something weird grabs your attention so much that you can't ignore it anymore? That's exactly how it was. Every time the van stopped, I'd find myself peeking through the curtain, trying to see more details, figure out what was going on. The strangest part was that he never looked in my direction. Even with the lights on, it was like I didn't exist to him. I even thought about filming what he was doing, but I don't know, it just felt wrong. So I dropped it. Then one night, when I woke up to grab some water from the kitchen, I heard a noise outside on my porch. My heart raced. I went to the door, carefully peeking through the window, and saw a package. Small, but wrapped in a very specific way, almost exactly like the ones my neighbor delivered. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone. I got that chill running up my spine. For some reason, I knew it was a mistake, that the package had been left there by accident. But still, I couldn't resist my curiosity and picked it up. I brought the package inside and put it on the table, my heart pounding, wondering what could be inside. The wrapping was simple, but done with such careful attention. Thick, dark paper, tied tightly with twine. I felt a mix of curiosity and fear, but something told me I had to see what was inside. I took a deep breath, untied the twine, and opened it. Inside, I found a gun. An old pistol, the heavy kind, with a cold shine that reflected the kitchen light. I almost dropped it out of shock. Why was my neighbor handing something like this off to people in the middle of the night? Along with the gun was a crumpled envelope with my name, scribbled on the front in messy, shaky handwriting. Inside the envelope was a short, straightforward note. Delivery confirmed. Keep it safe. I was terrified. My heart was racing, and 1,000 questions flooded my mind. Why would someone leave a gun at my door? And why was I supposed to keep it? I didn't know whether to laugh at the absurdity of it all or panic for real. I couldn't stop staring at the gun on the table. It felt so out of place, like an unwelcome presence, heavy and uncomfortable. My first instinct was to call the police, but what was I supposed to say? That I found a gun left on my doorstep by mistake? I also thought about just throwing it away, but the note scared me. What might happen if I didn't do what it said? After a while, I decided the best thing to do was try to return it to my neighbor. He clearly knew what he was doing with those packages, and I just wanted to get away from whatever mess I'd stumbled into. As soon as the sun came up, I waited for the chance to see him leave the house. When I saw him at the door, holding his usual box, I gathered my courage and went over there with the package in hand. He looked at me with an expression that froze me to my bones. He had this weird, almost frozen smile, and his eyes seemed to look right through me, cold and calculating. Before I could say anything, he stepped closer and whispered, "I knew you'd open it. Now you're part of it." I couldn't say a word. I just felt a chill run down my spine as he stared at me without blinking. After that conversation, I went back inside, not knowing what to do. I tried to process his words, but nothing made sense. Now you're part of it. Part of what, exactly? The feeling of being watched kept growing. During the day, I tried to ignore it, but every little noise outside made me jump. And at night, the van would come back, park in front of his house, and I felt like they knew I was there, spying, trying to figure things out. The problem was, I crossed the line. They knew I knew something. In a desperate impulse, I hid the gun in the back of a drawer and tried to convince myself that it was all just some big misunderstanding. I was almost convincing myself of that when, later that night, I heard a knock on the door. I approached slowly, my heart racing, and peeked through the window. And there he was, my neighbor, standing at the door with that same creepy smile, waiting. My legs felt like jelly, and for a moment, I was frozen. I didn't know what to do. If I opened the door, he could come in. If I didn't, what would he do? The anxiety was consuming me, and just looking at him there made me feel like he was waiting for me to make a decision. I decided not to open the door, but he didn't leave. Instead, he stood there, staring right at me through the window. It was like he knew I was watching. His smile never faded. He didn't say anything more. And after a while, which felt like forever, he just turned around and left. After that day, I never saw the van or my neighbor again. I don't know what happened to him, but after that encounter, everything stopped. It was like nothing had ever happened. I still have the gun, but I can't bring myself to get rid of it. The feeling that I'm always being watched never left. And even after all this time, I still don't know if that story is really over or if we're just on a break. I wasn't really the type of person who liked parties, but when I got an invite for an exclusive event at a mansion far away, I thought, why not? The invite came from a friend I didn't know too well, Ethan. He was an older student in my course, and we'd bumped into each other a few times at random parties. The invite was all formal, and the mansion looked like something straight out of a movie. Huge, surrounded by trees, with a long, winding driveway. I thought it might be an interesting night, so I got ready, put on a nice outfit and headed there, feeling mixed emotions. The place was strange, but hey, maybe I'd meet some new people or have a good story to tell later. When I got to the gates, I had no idea what I was about to experience. The mansion was grand, with the windows lit up, but something about it felt off. The silence. There was no music, no laughter, no conversations like you'd expect at a party. I was either the first to arrive, or at least I thought I was. When I got to the door, a tall man with neat hair opened it before I could knock. He smiled, but there was something very mechanical about that smile. His eyes didn't give off the same welcoming vibe as his voice. He invited me in, but I didn't pay much attention at the time. Only later, when I calmed down, did I realize there was something wrong with the atmosphere. Inside, the place was impressive. The decor was luxurious, almost too much so, but strangely enough, you could tell everything had a weird, artificial touch. I'm not sure if it was the type of furniture or how the lights were placed, but you could feel something wasn't quite right. The people there seemed as out of place as I did. One guy was sitting alone on the couch, staring blankly at his phone, while a woman in a red dress tried to start a conversation with him, but he wasn't interested at all. I didn't know anyone's name, and I started to wonder if maybe I had the wrong invite, but the hosts showed up soon after. They introduced themselves as Vincent and Clarissa, a couple that seemed like they walked right out of an old movie. They dressed in a way that didn't match the vibe of the party. Vincent wore a suit with a serious expression, and Clarissa, in a long dress with perfectly styled hair, had a smile that seemed rehearsed. They greeted me with excessive politeness, and when I looked around, I noticed there were no other guests besides me and a few others. The others were as quiet as I was, and something in the way they looked at us made me feel like we were being watched the entire time. They spoke to each other, but with forced naturalness, as though they were making an effort to keep the conversation going. I didn't want to be paranoid, but the feeling of discomfort only grew. The atmosphere was getting weirder. The silence felt heavy, and even though the mansion was big, there weren't many places to feel comfortable. Me and the other guests just stared at each other, unsure of what to do. Then, Vincent and Clarissa announced that the party would officially begin. Clarissa smiled, but this time her smile seemed too forced, like she was hiding something. She told us that, to kick things off, we'd have to participate in some exclusive activities. It all felt like some weird game of testing the guests. I looked around at the others, and it seemed like no one was excited, but no one dared to protest either. The first activity was a game of questions and answers, but the questions were personal. Each of us had to talk about our online experiences, like it was a public therapy session, but with no privacy whatsoever. The weirdest part was that while we played, the hosts kept taking notes, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something more intense. I felt uncomfortable. When it was my turn, something told me not to reveal anything, but they already knew more than I expected. Vincent looked me in the eyes and asked, "Have you ever done something illegal? Something that could get you in trouble?" My stomach twisted. How did he know that? I tried to dodge the question, but Clarissa interrupted with a smile that wasn't friendly anymore. "You have something to hide, don't you?" The tension in the room was palpable. Clarissa's words echoed in my head, and I couldn't stop thinking about how she knew so much about me. I wasn't at peace with the situation, and a feeling of panic started to settle in. They were playing a dangerous game, but I didn't know just how deep it went. Before I could think of a convincing answer, the other guests started to get uneasy too. One guy with long hair looked nervous, sweating as he stared at the hosts. He suddenly stood up and said, "This isn't right. You're invading our privacy." Vincent looked at him with a blank stare and calmly replied, almost distant, "You still don't get it, do you? We're not here to be your friends." That's when I realized something much darker was going on. Clarissa came in with a folder and slammed it down in front of me. She smiled again, but this time, the smile was cold in a way I'd never seen before. Inside the folder were screenshots of my online activities, things I'd done on sites I thought were private, things no one should know. My heart started racing. How did they have this? How did they know everything? Clarissa wasted no time. She stared at me and said, "You can choose, participate in our activities, or these details get spread around. Everyone will know what you've done, where you've been, who you've been with." I was in shock. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of how I ended up in this situation. But somehow, the feeling that there was no way out was stronger than anything else. The room was tense, and I could feel the pressure building. I knew I couldn't give in to them. It was like my life was in their hands, and every decision I made was pushing me deeper into a dead end. I looked at the other guests, but they were all silent, as if they knew speaking up would only make things worse. Clarissa and Vincent waited for an answer, but I took a deep breath and decided to face whatever came next. "I'm not doing what you want," I said, trying to sound more confident than I really was. That's when things started happening faster than I could keep up with. Vincent turned serious, and Clarissa shot him a look that made me realize they weren't playing around. But then, suddenly, the atmosphere in the room changed. I heard a loud noise from upstairs, something heavy, like someone had fallen. Clarissa and Vincent exchanged a quick glance, and before I could ask what was going on, they both rushed upstairs. I seized the moment and ran to the door. When I got there, it was locked, but someone inside the house seemed to be helping me. One of the guests had followed me, and together we managed to open the door and escape through the back exit. We made it out, but my mind was still racing, unable to process how I ended up in that situation. The next day, I tried to block everything that had happened that night from my mind. But to my surprise, days later, the news started to spread. Vincent and Clarissa were arrested, and I found out they'd been convicted of serious crimes, including extortion, invasion of privacy, and trafficking personal information. They'd been running a scheme where they collected data on their victims and forced them to participate in illegal activities, threatening to expose everything. I never found out how they tracked me down, but I'm grateful I got out before things got even more dangerous. And honestly, I just hope those two rot in prison. I moved into my new apartment about 6 months ago, right after landing a job I couldn't turn down. I had lived alone before, but this was the first time I'd picked a place entirely on my own. It was a quiet neighborhood, a small one-bedroom apartment with big windows and an old, creaky floor that somehow had its charm. The rent was affordable, and the building looked like it had some history, you know? I was excited, really excited, actually, to set everything up, decorate, and make the space my own. For the first few days, everything seemed perfect, or almost perfect. It all started when I found a note inside one of my favorite books, the one I always keep on my bedside table. I remember one night I grabbed the book to read, and as I opened to the page where I had left off, a piece of paper fell out. I picked it up and in small, neat handwriting it said, "Good choice." I felt a little confused, even laughed it off at first, thinking maybe I'd put it there and just forgotten. But the handwriting wasn't mine, and I was certain I'd never written anything like that. It was weird, sure, but I tried to ignore it, assuming maybe the note had been there since I bought the book secondhand. Over the next few days, I went on with life as usual, but I couldn't shake the note from my mind. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I would have noticed a note like that before, especially since it was a book I read every night. I decided not to think too much about it, but about a week later, another note showed up. This time, it was in the drawer where I keep my clothes. It was a folded-up piece of paper, a bit crumpled, and it said something like, "Nice choice of clothes." That gave me chills. This wasn't some old note I'd forgotten about. Someone had put it there, and I had no idea who could be getting into my apartment. I started paying more attention to every little detail, any sign that someone might have been in my place while I was out. I began checking if the windows were locked and triple-checking the door before leaving. But it didn't matter. More notes kept showing up. Some were just odd compliments, like, "You have good taste in books," or "This coffee smells great." And it was always in that same small, neat handwriting. The feeling that I was being watched started to get to me. It was like someone knew every little detail of my routine, my preferences. Weeks went by, and the notes didn't stop. Each time, they'd show up in more personal places. One was in the pocket of a jacket I wore almost daily with the phrase, "Looks good on you." Another was in the kitchen, inside one of my favorite mugs. "Hope you enjoy the coffee." I didn't know what to think anymore. I started to get suspicious of everyone. The janitor, the neighbors, even my coworkers, even though none of them knew where I lived. And I had this constant fear that if I told anyone, they'd think I was paranoid or making it up. Things started to become unbearable. I could barely sleep, thinking someone could come in at any moment. I left the TV on at night, just to feel like I wasn't completely alone. I began hearing noises around the apartment, little creaks or footsteps that I was sure were real, but I could never find anything. The sense of invasion was consuming me. and I had no idea where this would end. Then one night, I got home later than usual and found a new note, but this time it was taped to the refrigerator door, right out in the open. The message was simple, but it made my heart race like never before. It said, "I liked your friend." I froze, because it made sense. The day before, a friend had come over, something that rarely happened. That note was proof that this person was really watching me closely, knowing exactly what was happening in my daily life. After that, I decided to set up a few hidden cameras around the apartment. I didn't tell anyone. I wanted to catch whoever this was in the act, whoever it might be. I was careful, setting up a camera in the living room, another in the bedroom, and a third in the kitchen. I spent the next few days going over the recordings, hoping not to see anything but, at the same time, wanting answers. I was already losing sleep and peace, so this had to end somehow. After a few days of checking the recordings and finding nothing, I started to think maybe it was all just a mind game, that I was being paranoid. But then, one morning, I found one last note, and this time it was right beside the living room camera, as if the person wanted to taunt me. The message said, "Nice cameras, but they won't stop me." At that moment, I felt a terror so deep that I could hardly breathe. The thought that someone was one step ahead, knowing everything I did, was unbearable. That same day, I decided to leave the apartment. I grabbed the essentials and walked out, not looking back. In the days that followed, I arranged everything with the landlord to break the lease, without explaining the real reason. Today, I'm living in a new place, and the notes have stopped. Sometimes, I still wonder who could have been behind it and how they got in and out without being noticed, but I'd rather not know. All I know is, since I left that apartment, I haven't found any more mysterious notes, and I pray I never will. I was about 16 when this all started happening, and honestly, I can't even tell you how long it took me to actually notice it. My house was one of those old builds, you know, from the 1930s, with wooden floors and windows that creaked even with the lightest breeze. We'd lived there since I could remember, and my parents always said that the noises were just the house adjusting over time. But one night, around 3 in the morning, I heard a different sound, like something light dragging above me, almost as if someone was walking slowly. You know that feeling when a sound is so clear, you're certain it's real and not just in your head? That's exactly how it felt. At first, I ignored it, figuring I was just being paranoid. But then, the sound came back over the next few nights, always at the same time, and it got louder each time. I started feeling this strange chill every evening, like something was watching me, even though I knew no one was there. Or at least no one I could see. I told my parents, of course, but they just laughed and called me too imaginative. My mom even joked that the attic was haunted, just to mess with me. I tried to ignore it, but it was like the sound was getting closer to my room every night, like some presence was moving, right above me. After about 3 weeks of this, I started getting obsessed with the idea that there really was something up there. I've always been a bit curious, and honestly, this whole thing was already keeping me up at night. So one night, while my parents were asleep, I decided to stay awake and wait for the sound to start. When it finally did, I sat up in bed, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It was as if the noise moved above my bedroom walls, back and forth. That's when I noticed something odd. The walls had this muffled echo, like there was some hollow space between my room and the attic. The next day, with daylight to help, I started inspecting my room. I knocked on the walls, trying to pinpoint where the sound seemed to come from at night. That's when I noticed a wooden panel that, for some reason, looked poorly fitted, right next to my closet. I'd never noticed it before. It looked a bit newer than the rest of the room, like it was added after the house was built. My heart was pounding as I went over to it and, with some effort, managed to pull it open. Behind the panel, I found a foldable ladder, leading straight up into the attic. I stared at the ladder for a long time, almost hypnotized. I don't know if it was fear or just curiosity, but something in me wanted to climb up. Still, I decided to wait until later, when it was dark and quiet, because if there really was someone up there, I didn't want to be noticed. So I waited, and finally, past midnight, I grabbed a flashlight and started to climb. The ladder was old and creaked under my weight, and every noise seemed to echo through the whole house. When I reached the top, with the flashlight shaking in my hand. I shone it around the attic, which was partly covered in thick dust and cobwebs. But then I saw it right in the corner, an old, worn-out mattress, and beside it, a pile of crumpled food wrappers and some water bottles. Someone had definitely been there, and not long ago. The place had this sour smell, like a mix of old stuff and sweat, and the mattress looked freshly messed up, like someone had just gotten up. I tried to imagine who or what could have been living in my attic, so close to me all this time, but my mind was racing. I felt this weird mix of disgust, fear, and a strange curiosity. The first thing that crossed my mind was to get out of there as fast as possible, but something held me back. Part of me still wanted to understand. Whoever was up there wasn't just some random intruder. It felt like someone trying to stay hidden, trying to go unnoticed. The mattress had deep marks, as if it had been used for a long time. And the food wrappers were from cheap brands, probably from convenience stores nearby. The feeling of being so close to someone's secret life, someone I'd never noticed, sent shivers down my spine. It was like I'd invaded a private space, even though, technically, the attic was part of my house. I tried to find something else that could explain what was going on, but the place was empty except for the mattress and wrappers. But as I turned to go back down, I noticed something that made me freeze. Right there on one of the wooden beams was a series of scratched marks, like someone had been counting the days they spent there. There were dozens of marks, all lined up. At that moment, a wave of panic washed over me. Whoever was up there had been there a long time, silent and hidden, while I slept, watched TV, and lived my life down below, totally clueless. The thought that someone might have been hiding up there, maybe even watching my every move, put me on edge like never before. I climbed down the ladder as quietly as I could, as if I was scared they might still be around. When I finally got back to my room, I closed the panel carefully and shoved my closet against it, as if that would be enough to keep anyone from coming out. I knew I had to tell my parents, but I was also afraid they just wouldn't believe me, or worse, that they'd think I was making it all up. Still, the next morning, I finally got the courage to tell them everything, down to the last detail. They listened patiently, but in the end, they just laughed, saying it was a phase and that I'd probably imagined it all. I couldn't convince them to check the attic, and when I suggested that someone might have actually broken into the house, they just nodded and said they were too tired for ghost stories. Frustration welled up in me, and I started feeling this mix of anger and helplessness. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I wasn't alone in that house. After that talk with my parents, I spent nights even more on edge. Even though they ignored it, I couldn't shake the idea that the person could come back anytime. I locked my bedroom door every night and started sleeping with a kitchen knife under my pillow. Every little noise made me jump, and sleep became almost impossible. No matter how much I tried to convince myself I was safe, the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I kept expecting that panel to open any second, and for someone to come out, straight from the darkness. Then one day, I decided I couldn't live like that anymore. I waited for a weekend when my parents were out and, heart-pounding, went back up to the attic, but this time, ready to end it once and for all. As soon as I climbed up, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. The mattress and food wrappers were gone. The attic looked completely empty, like no one had ever been there. But on the beam where I'd seen the scratches before, there was one last mark, made recently. It looked like a number, or maybe a message I couldn't make out. I didn't want to stay in that attic a second longer. Since then, I haven't heard a single noise. Even with the attic silent since then, I couldn't fully relax. I spent weeks trying to figure out what that last mark could mean. Was it a warning? A final count before the person left? Even though the fear slowly faded, I still caught myself glancing at that hidden panel in my room, half expecting to see some sign that the stranger had come back. I still had that feeling, almost like paranoia, that someone, somewhere, was still watching me. In the end, I never told my parents about that last part. Even though they'd probably think it was all just my imagination, I chose to keep it to myself. Only someone who's gone through something like that would understand how surreal it is to know that someone had lived in secret, right there, so close, without anyone ever noticing. Maybe that person was just looking for a place to stay, or maybe they were watching, planning something. I'll never know, And that's what makes it even scarier. Since then, I've had one clear rule: never, ever ignore the noises in the house. Who knows what could be hiding right above or below us? Well, I'm going to start by telling you something I never imagined would happen to me. In 2017, after I finished high school, my parents decided to go on a month-long trip and left me alone at the family cabin, near a lake far from everything. I was in need of some time alone, to think about life, with no one around. The cabin had always been a peaceful place where I spent a few vacations when I was younger, but this time, things felt a bit different. Maybe it was the fact that I was totally isolated, with no neighbors nearby, and the lake, which had always been super calm, felt strange. On the first night, I decided to sit on the deck, with my feet touching the water. The warmth of the night was actually nice, and the gentle breeze made the trees sway slowly. I just sat there, doing nothing, thinking and trying to enjoy the silence. But then I noticed something strange. Far in the distance, in the middle of the lake, I saw some movement in the water. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. Something was moving slowly, coming toward me. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a big fish, but I don't know. There was something about the movement that made me feel uneasy. In the following days, the movement in the water didn't stop. In fact, it seemed to happen more often, as if whatever it was getting closer and closer to the deck. Sometimes, at night, I'd sit out there again, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I really wanted to believe it was just some animal, but the feeling that something wasn't right kept growing. I kept staring at that spot on the lake where the water was moving, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling of how it moved. It wasn't like a fish or anything else I'd ever seen. One night, pretty late, I decided to turn off the lights in the cabin and just sit in the dark, watching the lake. Suddenly, something caught my eye. I saw a figure, far away, but it looked like a human shape, standing in the water. It wasn't something you expect to see at night on a lake, I froze, not sure if I should react or if I was just seeing things. The figure stayed still, but the water around it seemed to vibrate in a strange way. I couldn't take my eyes off it. It was like something was holding me there, stopping me from moving or screaming. We just stayed like that for a few minutes, me staring at the figure, and it, still there. It didn't make a sound, didn't move. It just stood there, like it was waiting for me. I decided I had to do something. The fear was taking over, and I knew I had to do something to get rid of that feeling in my chest. With my hand shaking, I went over to the outdoor light and turned it on, hoping the light would make the figure disappear. And that's exactly what happened. The moment the light hit the lake, the figure vanished. It didn't move, didn't disappear slowly. It just vanished, like it had never been there. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. But the feeling of discomfort didn't go away. Whatever it was, I knew it was still there, watching. The next morning, I tried convincing myself that everything had been a nightmare, or maybe an illusion from the exhaustion. But when I went to the deck, I saw something I couldn't deny. Fresh mud and algae marks spread across the wooden floor, as if someone had come out of the water and walked over to that spot. There was no way. No animal could have done that, or the wind. And the worst part? The marks were right next to the cabin door, as if that figure had been watching me while I slept. That day, the peace I was looking for was gone for good. On my last night there, something happened that I'll never be able to explain. I was sleeping deeply, but I suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. I don't know why, but something made me open my eyes. The room was completely dark, but what made me sit up in bed was the sound. A strange sound, like heavy breathing, coming from somewhere near me. I froze for a few seconds, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It was deep breathing, like someone was right next to my bed, but there was no one there. The air felt thicker, and the room was eerily quiet, except for that sound. I got up and turned on the light, my hand still trembling. The room was empty, just as I expected, but when I looked at the door, something made me choke. A drop of water was running down the door frame, like someone had just passed by, with wet feet. I looked around, as if expecting to see someone there, but there was nothing. It was like the presence of water, of whatever had been there, had just reached me. I stood there, staring at the drop of water running down the wood, and something inside me knew it wasn't over. That thing, whatever it was, hadn't gone away. Since then, the feeling of being watched has never left me. I packed my things, did my best to clean up the mess, and left as quickly as I could. On the drive back, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, always with the feeling that someone was behind me, following me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. What was that figure in the lake? And what the hell was going on in that cabin? I never figured it out, and maybe it's better that way. But what I can tell you is that, to this day, whenever I pass by a lake at night, a part of me still expects to see that figure in the water. I never went back to that cabin, not for a second. Something inside me knew that if I went back, that feeling of terror would catch up to me again. Whatever was in the lake, it hadn't gone away. And honestly, I hope it never finds me again.
Back then, I was living on the streets, without much choice but to look for safe places to sleep and survive the cold at night. I'd lost my job a few months before, and like a lot of things in my life, everything started to fall apart after that. I ended up in this old park, kind of isolated on the outskirts of the city. The place was weird, almost no lighting, and there was this old fountain in the center, surrounded by thick trees that blocked the little bit of light coming from far-off street lamps. I figured no one would bother me there, and that the sound of the water might help me sleep. I wrapped myself up in my thin blanket and got as comfortable as I could, trying to ignore the discomfort and the cold. I don't know how long I managed to sleep, but I was woken up by a strange sound. Voices. At first, I thought it was just in my head, but then I realized there were actually two male voices nearby, talking quietly. I froze for a moment, trying to listen without making a sound. The voices were muffled, but they had this tense edge to them that you could feel even from a distance, like they were arguing or plotting something. One of them sounded angry, with this deep, threatening tone, while the other one was answering in a calmer, but equally dark way. I felt a chill go up my spine, and I really wanted to get out of there, but something kept me frozen, maybe curiosity or fear of making noise if I moved. As I snuck closer to hide better, I could make out bits of the scene. One of them, a tall, bulky man, was holding a shovel and looked like he was digging a hole. I couldn't see his face too well because of the darkness, but his movements were quick and determined, like he'd done this before. The other guy had his back to me and was holding something heavy. It looked like a large, dark sack, all lumpy like it had something big inside. I tried to keep my breathing quiet, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought they'd hear it any second. It wasn't a normal scene. There was a tension in the air, a heaviness that made my skin crawl. I knew I should get out of there, but something kept me from just getting up and running. While the guy kept digging, the other one was looking around with this suspicious look on his face, like he felt they weren't alone. The tension between them kept building, and I could feel the fear rising in me. Suddenly, the man with the sack turned slightly, and for a second, I thought he looked right at me. My whole body froze. He took a few steps forward, like he was examining the area. That's when I realized he was coming in my direction, and I knew at that moment that if he found me there, things could go really bad for me. I curled up as small as I could in the bushes, holding my breath, trying to think of a way to get out. I knew I only had a few seconds to decide what to do. If I stayed there, he'd probably find me, but running might give me away too. I decided to move slowly, creeping back further into the bushes, trying not to make any noise. But with each step, the guy seemed to get closer. The sound of dry leaves under my feet was like thunder in my head, and I could barely control the panic building inside me. I glanced through the leaves and saw him stop walking for a moment, staring straight in my direction, like he was trying to see through the shadows. My heart was practically pounding out of my chest, and I had only one thought: get out of there as fast as possible. With a quick move, I got up and started running. I didn't look back, just headed in the opposite direction, trying to remember the paths in the park to avoid doubling back. Adrenaline took over, and I was running without thinking, just hearing my heavy breathing and the sound of branches snapping under my feet. But then, suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. They were chasing me. The guy must have noticed my escape and was now coming after me. The darkness of the park seemed to close in around me, and the fear of being caught made me stumble, almost losing my balance a few times. But I knew I couldn't stop. Any pause could mean the end for me. As I ran, my memory of the path got all mixed up, and I realized I was getting more and more lost. The trees seemed to close in tighter, and the few working street lamps barely lit the ground. I glanced back occasionally just to confirm he was still following, and he was getting closer. I could make out his figure, tall and heavy, moving quickly, like he had experience hunting down people trying to escape. The sound of his boots crushing leaves echoed through the empty park, and every time I looked, he seemed closer. I couldn't imagine what they'd do to me if they caught me, but something told me it wouldn't be anything good. My legs were already tired, and the pain in my ribs from breathing so hard felt like fire inside me, but I couldn't stop. I started looking around for any place I could hide, even if it was just to buy me a few extra seconds. That's when I spotted an area with taller bushes near a group of trees. I threw myself in there, lying on the ground, trying to make as little noise as possible. I closed my eyes and held my breath, hoping he wouldn't find me. I heard his footsteps getting louder, and he stopped right near where I was. I tried to control my heart, which felt like it was beating so loudly inside my chest. He stood there for a few seconds, breathing heavily, like he was listening and sensing every sound around. At that moment, any wrong move could be my last. After what felt like endless minutes, I heard him start to walk away. I waited until his footsteps had completely faded before I let out a breath. I got up slowly, still being careful not to make a sound, and looked around to make sure I was alone. My hands were shaking, and I knew I needed to get out of there before he or the other guy came back. I crept through the bushes, taking a different path, but the fear was still with me. I felt like at any moment, they might show up again, ready to silence me for good. I tried not to think too much and focused only on finding the exit of the park. Finally, I saw the park gates in the distance and ran as fast as I could. When I passed through the gates, I didn't stop until I was a few blocks away, with my legs shaking and my heart still racing. I sat down on a curb, trying to process what had just happened. To this day, I still think about what I might have seen if I'd stayed there a little longer. Maybe they were burying some kind of evidence, or something worse. That was the last time I ever risked sleeping in a deserted park. After that night, every shadow seemed to hide a secret, and the sound of voices at night never sounded the same to me again.